A-slat, Siaya, Siam, Sialialaqua, Quelmat, Tel Squee, Talitsakas will Silwayet. Could probably take my whole 2 minutes just to introduce myself in Halkamalam and have to translate it into English, so I'm not going to do that. I wanted to talk about reducing the inequality among social groups within countries, and of course I want to have a focus in on Indigenous peoples within this country and how we might reduce some of the inequalities amongst Indigenous and the rest of Canada. So when I looked at some of the things outlined in our handout, one of them being the elimination of discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, I went immediately to the elimination of the Indian Act. I think that is certainly one of the most biggest, largest steps that we could take, and I can certainly see it happening within the next 15 years. The Indian Act is by far one of the most oppressive pieces of legislation Canada has ever put into force and effect, and it still is in place in 2015. So I think by 2030, we can certainly aim to have it abolished and replaced with something geared towards Indigenous resurgence and empowerment. We could also have a look at the numbers of Indigenous peoples currently filling the prison system and work at eliminating or at least minimizing the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples within the system. We have now moved beyond the theory of biology or beyond the theory that there's a genetic gene that Indigenous people somehow, we have a genetic code within us that makes us commit crime more so than other groups of people. We now know that not to be the case. So why are we overrepresented within the prison system? And for us to have a look at lowering those numbers. And the same applies for the child welfare system as well. We have an overrepresentation of Indigenous children within the care of the Ministry of Children and Family Services. And I think there's a lot of good work that can easily be done over the next 15 years in reducing those numbers in terms of policy, practice, and discriminatory laws. We can also look at providing clean drinking water for Indigenous peoples. And here I ask people to adopt the NIMBY syndrome, to think about all of these, in particular, this notion of not in my backyard. As Canadians, let's make sure that this is not happening in our own backyard before we look elsewhere. Unfettered access to our own food sources. Food sovereignty is a huge thing for Canadians, in particular Indigenous peoples, for us to have access to our own food sources. We're not able to gain our calcium from dairy the way most Canadians can. We need to get our calcium from our fish. We need unfettered access to our food supply and food sovereignty. I was also asked to think about how all of this intersects with what I do here at UFV in terms of teaching Indigenous content courses across disciplines. And part of what ends up happening is I'm always having to tell the disparaging story. I'm always having to tell the story of victimization, the sad stories of the murdered and missing Indigenous women, and nobody wanting to do anything. And thank you, Dr. Miller, for bringing our attention to that in the Moose Hide campaign. So what I would like to see is for within the next 15 years, for me to be able to change the stories that I'm telling and to be able to move towards stories of empowerment and stories of victory, because there are way more of those to be told in relation to Indigenous peoples than the victimization and the sad stories. So